A bitter January day, the morning after a Doors concert, their biggest yet, at Madison Square Garden. The gate was $125,000. The performance was obedient and bland. The sound was rotten. The highs went shooting straight up from the stage, hit the ceiling, and came screeching off the walls. The minute the audience screamed for "Light My Fire," the Doors gave it to them. They know by now that it's the best they can do. There was the usual crowd of chickies hanging out in the lobby of the Plaza, a stately mansion of the aristocracy of transient New Yorkers. The Doors were registered there, and so were a few of the more well-heeled groupies who occupied a room and tried desperately to get Jim Morrison on the telephone all day. Downstairs, a small crowd of girls and a few boys chattered among themselves. These are seasoned pop star hunters. They see someone come in with a tape recorder and size me up. They approach me very hesitantly, eyes charred, voices hushed. These girls wanted not to go upstairs and play, but only to know if Jim Morrison was all right. Was he dying? One of them asked me. Was he desperately unhappy? And why was he incommunicado that day? They were earnestly and profoundly disturbed. Some of them claimed to have seen Morrison stick a pin in his eye last September. Enthralled by the manic chaos the Doors manifest for their stage act, these fans went up a wall at the thought of Morrison turning the destruction on himself. The kingdom was crumbling, and these fans sensed that Morrison, in the métier of the Doors, was dying. They were there, as it were, to wail at the wake. I thought back to September, when the Doors were last in New York. It flashed on me as I stepped into the elevator to the 14th floor, where the Doors were waiting for reporters. Last September had been the Singer Bowl concert on the grounds of the New York World's Fair. Most of the fair had been disassembled, but the bowl was kept as a concert establishment. The Doors concert had ended in a small riot last September. It was a double bill, the Doors and the Who. A zealous editor was excited about the idea of a confrontation of the sacrosanct, and sent me out on the story. It was a confrontation of garbage, and it depressed me, and I didn't write a story about it. If I'd been at all concerned about the Doors, the Singer Bowl concert would have been the occasion when I might have seen the end coming. Babe Hill, a portly, sunburned beach mongrel, part of a film crew which used to travel with the Doors, confirmed my editor's hopes. There's already been some trouble. He grinned. The Who don't want the Doors equipment on stage when they play. I think they're sore because they didn't get top billing. They threatened to wreck the Doors equipment if it's there when they close the set. It was a humid, tense end of summer evening, and the natives had been quiet all season, almost too quiet. I was apprehensive, and I mentioned the possibility of trouble to Hill. "That's what we want," said Hill indifferently, stooping to check out a tape recorder. Film of unruly kids. Babe Hill and Paul, another member of the film crew, and I got into a limousine and waited for Morrison to come out of the motel in which they were staying. He arrived, slouched in the seat of the car, and we headed out of New York and into Queens, toward the Singer Bowl. None of us, much less the driver, knowing exactly where it was. Paul and Babe and Jim chatted sporadically in the back seat of the car. "We ought to see more of New York," Paul suggested. "We could take the boat ride around Manhattan or just go walking around. Do you ever go out in the street, Jim?" "Not often," answered Morrison absently. He eyed me steadily and wearily for a full minute before he spoke. I returned his gaze. "Who's that strange creature in front?" He grinned shyly at an introduction and offered me a beer. In contrast to the depraved arrogance Morrison projects on stage, he's endearingly bashful, almost awkwardly shy at other times. He affects indifference, apes bravado, and generally gives the appearance of deep thought, flippant attitudes, helpless stupor, anything he can get away with until he sizes up the strange elements of the scene. Either he's watching and waiting, and taking it all in, or he's uncertain and recedes, throwing up a pose as a cover. Much to my genuine surprise, I liked him instantly, and have liked him ever since. When the cursory conversation dwindled, he leafed through a copy of the Village Voice. "Sure is a bore. Sure ain't nothing happening around here." He flipped the paper to the floor of the car, slouched morosely in the seat, and began to sing Eleanor Rigby, scattering the lyrics, mumbling something about rice all over her face. "You're a weird man," I laughed. He grinned, utterly delighted. "I tries," he drawled in response, closing his eyes and smiling. The driver got lost, and Morrison accused him of anarchy. We got caught in the traffic jam of people coming to the Singer Bowl. Eventually, we found the road to the stage entrance. As we rounded the bend, a bunch of fans come into view. They had been waiting for just this car. They ran up to the limousine, and we had to stop halfway to the building. They ganged the car, hands and faces pressed to every available window. They ran around the front of the car, looking in, and some of them jumped on the back. There was laughter and squeals, very playful, very happy. The windows were closed, and I reached across his chest to snap the lock on Morrison's door. He got there before me and opened it. Hands reached in, touching him, pulling at his clothing. He stepped out of the car and stood in the midst of them. They pressed beads and photos and drawings into hands. "Will some of you girls escort me backstage?" Morrison laughed huskily, almost embarrassed. "I might get mobbed or something." Backstage was a steamy cement locker room. The area was crawling with photographers and fans who had somehow slipped by the guards. There had been no trouble, so security was lax. Jim decided to walk around outside. Looking over his shoulder to make certain the cameraman was behind him, he stepped out into the arena. He got about 20 feet before he was noticed. Then hundreds of people swarmed up to him, running up to him, wanting to get near him, afraid to get too close. "He's going to get himself killed tonight," someone remarked. I detected a trace of hopefulness in his voice. The program started late. Nothing went right all evening. During the Who's set, the revolving stage broke down, and hefty repairmen hammered on stage trying to repair it. A fourth of the audience couldn't see. They were getting irritated. Peter Townsend did a bump and grind, quipping, "Had to get one in before Jim Morrison comes on." At the close of the Who's set, the three Doors minus Morrison walked outside to watch the Who tear up the stage. Townsend dashed the guitar to the floor several times before it shattered. He threw pieces to the audience and people fought for the fragments. Drums rolled off the platform, kicked in. From where I was standing, I could see an equipment man light a smoke bomb. It was anticlimactical. The Who had bombed. Bad set. Beyond redemption. The breakup scene seemed inevitable, the only way off the stage. But the crowd was roaring. There were 15,000 of them, and they were whipped to a frenzy from sheer frustration, if nothing else. A full half hour passed, and they were stomping and shouting, demanding the Doors. Manzarek, Krieger, and Densmore were introduced, and they vamped on stage waiting for Morrison, who was deliberately taking his time. When he stepped into the doorway, a cheer went up. He smiled very slightly, posed just so, drawn up to full height, steely, intense. I thought I saw him shiver. A cry went up, and there was something agonized about it, something almost desperate. Girls hung over the tier above, screaming and sobbing. The security cops formed a wedge in front of him and a line behind him, completely surrounding him. They escorted him safely to the stage, through the people that leapt at him, trying to grab him. He grabbed the mic and began to sing. A good portion of the audience still couldn't see, and they were furious. Crowds stormed the front of the stage and were turned back. The Doors took their time, hamming around in between songs, further infuriating the crowd. Some were trying to climb on stage, and the rest were cheering them on. Jim spun around and growled songs at them, ad-libbing, improvising, doing this ominous dance. The cameramen were on stage the whole time following him around. Hysteria was building. I checked in back of me every few minutes to make sure the way to the door was cleared, in case I had to make a run for it. "Cool down," Morrison urged seductively. "We're going to be here a long time." "Light my fire, light my fire," Morrison shrieked, moaned, gyrated, and minced to the edge of the stage, hovering over the ringside crowd. Hands reached out and grabbed him, and the cops had to pry them away. Paul and Babe ducked a piece of wood which came flying onto the stage. Morrison grabbed it and heaved it back into the crowd. A moment later, it came sailing through the air again. People were fighting and breaking up chairs. The Doors were hardly visible from any angle, because there were about 20 cops on stage. Morrison had made them a part of the act. The set was closing and someone pulled me backstage. The Doors had to be dragged through a mob of screaming kids. Everyone was removed from the backstage, except the Doors, Paul, Babe, and myself. There was banging on the outside doors, and the noise almost shook the walls. I was aggravated. The whole scene was senseless, meaningless. The trouble had erupted out of frustration. Everybody's frustration. The show was bad, the evening heat was sticky, and the sound, once again, was lousy. There was a lapse of rapport and a lapse of respect on the part of the Doors and the audience. The whole thing served no purpose. It didn't even let off steam. It was as inevitable as the Who's traditional freakout, which, to be fair, is a raving, beautiful scene when it truly culminates a set. We had to wait for an hour and the beer was passed around. The arena was cleared and Jim was in back, talking to a girl whose head had been seriously cut. The cameraman was filming it. John Densmore was batting an empty beer can against the wall with a piece of broken chair. He threw the slab of wood angrily against the wall, picked up a mop, took it outside to the stage, and started swabbing. He called for the cameraman to shoot it, cursed when they remained with Jim. Jim came back in. Do you think it looked phony? Me talking to her? He asked to nobody in particular. Nobody answered. We got into the car and headed back to the city. Wow, that was weird, said John. If they really got together and figured we're 15,000 and there are only a couple of hundred cops, they'd really... I can't decide if I dig it or I don't, he continued. Do you dig it, Jim? Jim didn't answer. In a way it's groovy, but it gets scary, John added. All that unrest. Jim turned around. They'd really do a revolt thing if I jumped off stage, wouldn't they? You'd be pretty messed up, man. Al, we should do something. They were throwing things and stuff. I threw about 20 drumsticks at them. We should throw money. Let's get a few hundred ones and throw them into the crowd. It'll be great for the movie. Paul laughed. Movie? Hell, I wouldn't be shooting, I'd be picking up the bread. We reached the motel and run into Pete Johnson, of all people. Upstairs, we sipped cold drinks and chatted. The riot was irrevocably behind us, and we just sat in a New York motel room. A bunch of young people on a late Saturday night wondering what to do with ourselves. Pete Johnson asked John about the group's recent disaster in the Hollywood Bowl, home territory for the Doors. Every time we get together and don't have to talk about anything else, we ask ourselves what went wrong. John was more than a little abashed. He continuously referred to the Doors as the dupe and peeled off winners like, hey, we know Hello, I Love You is bullshit, but we've never been played by Bill Drake before. Something very close to compassion overtook me. The Doors, for all practical purposes, were riding out their momentum. It just wasn't happening, and they knew it. The elevator reached the 14th floor, and I wondered how they'd be this time around. 4 months and another Los Angeles disaster later, they had sold out Madison Square Garden. A crowd schooled in the game rules of a Doors concert turned out. In major cities, a Doors concert is a McLuhannis football game. A roar of noise when the group is brought to the stage, a constant demand for Light My Fire. The crowd rushes the stage and gets turned back, a 30-yard gain. Kids light sparklers and cops extinguish them. The crowd boos, a 50-yard loss. Shouts and applause, a touchdown. We'd seen the show before. Block that kick. Hold that line. Morrison was mellow, subdued. No poem trips, howls, or writhing. His voice has never been smoother or more melodic. He was poised, self-assured, and smiling. It was a pretty fair concert where both the strengths and weaknesses of the Doors were visible, but they are weary of their music, weary of the Doors, weary maybe of themselves. Manzarek has an instinctive sense of energy levels. He ties all the elements together with the sonic pumping of his organ playing. Densmore, hardly a technically good drummer, manages to keep time and come off with surprisingly inventive figures now and then. He holds the drumsticks like 2 lamb chops, throws them to the chickies, likes bones to dogs. He flails his arms, pumps his legs, jerks his head around and throws his entire torso into the final crescendo slumps, oh so exerted after each song, head and arms, gasping for breath, and behind the new-grown mustache just the tiniest little condescending smile. If there's a star left in the Doors, it's Robbie Krieger, pulling sweet and salty notes out of his guitar, cuddling it close to him like a treasured baby, dripping of a fluid runs and peppery melodic lines. He's still an exciting guitarist. When they give him room to blow, he throws it all out and reels it in again, like a funky fisherman with a prize catch. That's rare, though. Like the rest of the musicians, Krieger is slicked over by the mystique of the Doors. Morrison took off his jacket and heaved it into the crowd. Later, uptown, in a Chinese restaurant, he shivered pathetically. No coat to keep him from the New York winter chill. Diane, the press agent, and I approached the room. I'd come to the plaza to interview the three musicians. It occurred to me that everyone writes about Morrison, and the Three Doors might also have something to say. Unfortunately, I was mistaken. Manzarek, tanned, handsome, placid, and indifferent, sat next to his gorgeous Oriental wife, Dorothy, and thumbed through a magazine. Densmore, a bony, uncertain man, was alternately helpful, hostile, and friendly. They were uptight, afraid to talk about certain things, nervous, suspicious, cynical. Krieger sprawled on an unmade bed watching from a distance behind shades. They evaded questions and issues. All in all, they were as glib and complacent as their music has sounded for months. I suggested that the Doors have had it. We're sure gonna fool them, John snorted. All we want to do is burn. But everyone in the room was evading the fact that the Doors haven't ignited for months. Performances have been fair to middling. The recording sessions for the fourth album haven't been going well. Morrison wasn't showing up for most of them, and he didn't know the words to the songs. The Slicks are even tired of them. A Doors story, once a hot piece of copy, was, by then, expendable. A well-known musician told me, a good while before, that Morrison had exposed himself on stage in Tucson, Arizona. It wasn't true, but John Densmore was outraged. That's how it starts, he fumed. Somebody starts a rumor like that, and then at the next show, if he doesn't top it, everybody is disappointed. Morrison rang the room from upstairs. He asked to speak to me. He complimented me on something I wrote about the Rolling Stones for Saturday Review, and invited me upstairs. I hardly hesitated. There was nothing going on the 14th floor. I asked him if the vicious press about the Doors was upsetting him. No, it's good for me, he said. It breaks the bubble. He'd been gazing at a copy of Jazz and Pop with the Jefferson Airplane in nightclub costumes on the cover. This is where it's all at, he moped. It's sad to be a part of a dying thing. By the end of the day, the conversation had passed beyond a level of communication, and we were all wallowing in each other's moods. There had been some rap, a couple of yawks, and incessant telephone calls from girls. I don't know why everyone makes a monster out of Jim, said Diane, the press agent, who'd been sipping a bit too much cognac. He's just a Jewish mother. I was beyond comprehension at that point. I just leaned my head back against the sofa on which I'd been sitting and asked myself if this trip was really necessary. I was depressed and disjointed as I hailed a cab to take me home. Later that night, I went out and saw Blood, Sweat, and Tears, the perfect remedy. Remember that next time you're low, blood, sweat, and tears is good for what ails you. Well, it's months later, and the Miami Doors fiasco has almost died down. People close to the group talk about the end. A former associate of the group says no. That would be too predictable. They're putting a lot of strings on the next album for a reason that must make some kind of sense to them. Maybe to drown them out. Who knows? But it's been over for the Doors for a long time now. Once they were fiery, arrogant, renegade emperors of the pop scene, and once they deserved it. They've made an unforgettable mark in the business. They remained unique in their prime. Some accountant probably told them to keep on performing, and they took his advice. Their booking agent is one of the few people that never complained that they were getting moldy. For an average of $50,000 a night, they can bust my chops all they want, he once told me. And I guess they bought it, and who could argue? They have a right to make a living at their price. But they know, and you know, and I know that it's a charade at this point. The Doors should rest in peace, not do an overlong encore. It hasn't lit anyone's fire in a good long time. The kingdom has crumbled. It's sad and a little ridiculous to sit in the middle of the ruins with your face hanging out after that.